So, without further ado, Representative Mark Baker.
So the words I always use are, it's interesting out there. It's really loose. You can have pretty much anything defined by interesting in Washington. Let me just say a few things, and I'm really here to hear from Yusuf as well, because I think it's so important. We get so little real information out of Gaza, and unfortunately with this administration's policies, we've done a lot to cause even further harm. We've shut off any USAID. We're stopping funding to UNRWA, which is providing a lot of the assistance, and we need to be doing just the opposite at this time. So 3 years ago, I led the first ever congressional delegation to Palestine, and that's what we called it, to Palestine. And we went there, and we had 5 members of Congress, I believe, that went with us on that delegation, and looked and saw everything that we could see. And on the final day, we were set up to meet UNRWA and go into Gaza for a day. And we had heard nothing that we weren't going to go until the night before they had said via phone that we weren't going to be allowed to go in. So I convinced about half of the group to still go in our bus to try to get in, because they never gave us anything in writing. We got there and they said, well, we told you you can't come. I go, yeah, but we never received it in writing. So they said, okay, give us an hour. And while we sat there, we watched bulldozers and other vehicles going through to take out some of the croplands and things, and part of the ongoing problems that we know have occurred there. And eventually we got our official no. But of course, an official no just to me means I want to go even more. And we want to see, it's been at least a decade since Keith Ellison was the last member of Congress to have gotten to Gaza, and there's too much and too important of why we have to be there. So a couple things I think I can share that hopefully are positive, because unfortunately a lot with this administration and the approach towards the West Bank and Gaza has not been good. But a couple things that are positive. One, recently we had a professor visiting from Gaza. We sat down and we kind of brainstormed a way, if they're not going to let us into Gaza, and they're not letting people very easily out of Gaza, we're going to say we don't care what that means, that wall that doesn't allow people to go through. We're going to start finding ways to have people-to-people connections. So I just looked on my calendar. It looks like later in November, we have a group of members of Congress and people within Gaza starting Skype sessions to let them know that we're watching what's going on, we're following. We're going to set this up with students, we're going to set this up with health professionals, and we're going to start to decide that doesn't matter. We're not going to take no for an answer, and that's one way virtually we can set up communication. I think that's really important. Another thing, we've had a conversation, the Progressive Caucus, as Sol mentioned, it's about 40% of the caucus. We have 100 members of the Democratic Caucus who are members of our caucus. Depending what happens with the Israeli reorganization of government, we plan on, if they do get a government reorganized, immediately asking to have a delegation go, but the delegation has to include, or at least the permission to include, Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, who were previously told they couldn't go. That is a completely, wholly unacceptable answer, that they're not allowed to. But in addition, we're also going to say we want to come into Gaza. And we have some commitments from our leadership that they will help us, which we have never had before when Paul Ryan was Speaker, that they will try to help us get into Gaza, because again, it's so important that we have that oversight. So, like I said, 3 years ago, my husband and I were on our delegation. Like I said, was it 5 or 6 members? Do you remember? 5, okay, and their spouses or family members that they brought with. And it really was a lot, I think, for people to go into Hebron and go into the various areas and see what was going on firsthand that unfortunately most people don't see. But in Gaza, we still don't have people really getting in to see very much there. We know that 1.1 million of the 2 million people are on food assistance. The conditions there are so bad. I mean, so many of us refer to it really as an open-air prison in many ways. That's probably the best, I think, comparison that you can have, that we simply can't have this White House pushing on things like not funding UNRWA, not providing the assistance that we have provided previously to the Palestinians, and it's part of what we're trying to change. So that's all I'm going to say. I'm not here to talk. I'm here to listen to Yusuf. And really, I guess one last thing I do want to make a strong push for. It's one thing when politicians have their dialogues that can help move things. It's another thing when people to people do. That's why you're all here. You're part of that movement. I truly, truly believe there would be nothing more powerful than to have a U.S. sister city in Gaza, an official recognition of that sister city relationship. I have talked to our new mayor. She is open to the conversation. I really think this is the perfect opportunity to try to do this. And I have been part of our sister city, as you know, and helping form the sister city in Colombia. I have been to our sister city in El Salvador. When you go to the Catholic Church there, and the 12 Stations of the Cross are from the war. They were a sister city because they were allowed to be a city because we became a sister city with them. And I don't know how many of you know that story, but that whole area had been depopulated. People had been pushed to Honduras during the war. And the people from our sister city in El Salvador said they wanted to come back. They came back to that area. The paramilitaries brutally killed and skinned 5 people and left them out to send a signal that you're going to leave. That next night, the Madison City Council formed the sister city relationship, and they were allowed to stay as a city because of that international observation. If we were able to do that with a sister city in Gaza, we would be at a people-to-people level changing many of the current dynamics that are going on. So I am committed to helping everyone do this. I hope there is an ability and a commitment from the people in this room. I think it's time. Let's make this a formal sister city, and we will have some really powerful outcomes by doing that. So thank you for having me today. I appreciate it, and I look forward to hearing from our speakers. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Representative Mark Pocan. We really appreciate your support. And if we could have a sister city in Gaza, we'd be thrilled. So let's all work on it. I have a couple quick announcements. You'll see the Maya Water Project brochures on your table, Clean Water for Children. It's through the Middle East Children's Alliance. So we're hoping to raise some money for another water filter. The kids in Gaza, that was their number one request when they were asked what they wanted. They want to bring clean water home to their families because, as Representative Mark Pocan said, I think it's like 95% of the water is undrinkable. So we are hoping we're going to collect some money after this event for this project. We also have a couple fair trade sales coming up, and the brochures are on your table. The first one is Sunday, November 24th at Orchard Ridge Church of Christ, which is 9 to 2 p.m. And then another one is the first Saturday of December 7th from 8 to 3 at the Monona Terrace, the Fair Trade Holiday Festival. So our crafts and more of them will be there. So we hope if you come that you'll stop by, and we have wonderful olive oil and Playgrounds for Palestine will be selling as well. So I want to just do a really quick to announce Naveen Al-Asri is just gonna introduce Huda, who is with Open Doors for Refugees, who's selling some crafts.
Yes, thank you very much, everybody. So I'm Naveen Al-Asri. I'm a professor at UW-Madison, and I volunteer with Open Doors for Refugees. And we are, of course, a local organization. We are 500 volunteers who are helping out refugees, and Hoda is one of our first ever project that we are initiating with the refugees. So Hoda, she's starting her handcraft just this month, and she's coming from Iraq, and she wants to establish a small business with her craft. So thank you very much for you, Madison Rafah Sisters, and all the other organizations who that invited us today. So please, stop by and see what Hoda has been working on for almost 6 months to have her crochet handcraft be available today. So thank you very much for hosting us, and thank you for coming, all of you.
So now I'm honored to introduce Youssef Jamal. He is a Palestinian writer and human rights activist from Gaza. Originally from Akkar in West Central Palestine, Yusuf's family was ethnically cleansed in 1948. He grew up in a refugee camp in southern Gaza, attending UN schools, and lived through the 3 major assaults that Israel launched on the Strip in 2008, 2012, and 2014. Yusuf received his BA from the Islamic University of Gaza and his MA from a university in Malaysia. For several years, he ran a library at Gaza's Center for Political and Developmental Studies. He's currently working on a PhD in international relations at Sakarya University in Turkey. In 2014, Yusuf was part of a team that toured the United States under the auspices of Just World Books and the American Friends Service Committee. They were launching the anthology, which the books are right here that you could buy after the presentation. Gaza Writers Back, short stories from young writers in Gaza, Palestine, to which Yusuf was a contributor. Since then, he has written frequently for Just World Educational and recently translated into English the book Dreaming of Freedom, Palestinian Children Prisoners Speak, which is also over here, about the situation of Palestinian children incarcerated, sometimes for several years, by the military court system that Israel has run in the occupied West Bank since 1967. And the book, I looked through it, and there's just amazing testimonies from youth prisoners, and it's an important book to check out. Yusuf is currently on a U.S. speaking tour sponsored by Just World Educational, and comes to the U.S. comes to us today from the Milwaukee stop on that tour. We are so pleased to have Yusuf here to share his perspective and experience from a place that is very much hidden from the American consciousness. Please join me in welcoming Yusuf Al-Jamal to Madison.
First, I would like to thank you all and to thank everyone who is involved in organizing this event today. And I'm sure there are many people who invested much time and efforts to make this talk possible today. So I would like to thank you all. It's a beautiful day. It's great to be here in Madison. It's my first time in Wisconsin. And I'm glad that I got to get here because I also faced difficulties getting the US visa first. But yeah, at last I am here, so I'm happy, and I'll be sharing my personal experience under incubation, because very often when Palestine is addressed, especially in the US media, Palestinians are faceless and voiceless. They are just numbers, and we are not numbers. And there's a project in Gaza called We Are Not Numbers. It's a website that I invite you to check out. So I'm here to tell personal stories because personal stories do matter and people relate to personal stories. And I have 2 presentations. So I will start with the presentation that includes the personal history of my family under occupation. And then I will connect this with the larger history, collective history of Palestinians under occupation, including the issue of child detainees in Israeli jails. I grew up in Nusayrat refugee camp in Gaza. This is in Nusayrat. It's right in the middle of the Gaza Strip. And it's one of 8 refugee camps in Gaza. It's not the most crowded refugee camp. We have, thanks God, 9 square kilometers where 85,000 Palestinians live. But for example, in Jabalia refugee camp, up here, which is 1 square kilometer, there are 90,000 Palestinian refugees living in this very crowded refugee camp. I attended UNRWA's free schools, so I'm very thankful to UNRWA, and I think support should continue to this UN agency until the issue of Palestinian refugees is resettled according to the UN General Assembly Resolution 194. I grew up in the refugee camp. It's very crowded, and we only receive basic services from UNRWA. So when we talk about support given to UNRWA, just to make sure that Palestinian refugees who were displaced in 1948 live in dignity. We do not live a luxurious life because of the services we get from UNRWA, we get free education, and that's why we have one of the highest, if not the highest, literacy rates in the world in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank. But we also get access to healthcare, basic healthcare, and other services such as sanitation. So I think it's important to make sure that the U.S. support to UNRWA doesn't stop. Keeping in mind that the current U.S. administration, the Trump administration, decided to cut it off completely. So in 1948, my family used to live in a village called Athar near the biggest major Palestinian city that was close to Athar at the time was Jaffa. And my family ended up as refugees in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. So my mother's side ended up in the West Bank. It was the same family, extended family. And my father's family ended up in the Gaza Strip. That's where I grew up. And speaking of Rafah, initially my grandfather landed in Rafah for 2 years. And then he moved to Nusayrat refugee camp. And I will be talking about Rafah. Maybe, it's very relevant to talk about Rafah and the difficulties people face there. And I also have family in Jordan. I have family in the Gulf. I have family in Europe. I have family everywhere in the world. And I cannot meet them in Palestine. I met a distant uncle recently in DC, Washington, DC, but not in Palestine. Because it's very difficult especially to get to the West Bank, as I will explain later on. So this is the village. Today it's called Kiryat Ekron. And it used to be the biblical kingdom of Ekron. And my great-grandfather was killed in the village when Zionist militias invaded the village, and he was armed, so he had a gun, and he fought until the last bullet. And what he did, he tied his legs together so that he doesn't run away when they come in, because he knew they would come in and they would kill people in the village, but he did not want to, die escaping or to be ethnically cleansed from his village. So he died days before the village was captured. So his children ended up in the Gaza Strip. This is my father's side of the family. And speaking of life in the refugee camp is very crowded and people live a very poor life. Knowing that 70% of Gaza's population are refugees, including myself. So in Nusayrat refugee camp, we have two important facilities that impacted the lives of refugees in the entire Gaza Strip. The only Gaza power plant, as well as the only sewage treatment facility. And both of them were bombed by Israel, destroyed in 2009. And this means that people in Gaza, the issue of electricity outages is nothing new. It did not start in 2014. It started back in the days in 2006 when Israel bombed the only power plant again with nearly 11 F-16 missiles. And they destroyed the power plant completely. And since then, that's the year my youngest brother was born. He never saw a full day of electricity. So we have up to 20 hours of electricity outages per day. And the power plant doesn't provide Gaza with its needs of electricity. So when it functions completely, it provides Gaza with 60% of its need of electricity. And then we have an Israeli line and another Egyptian line. So Rafah gets most of its electricity from Egypt because it's close to Egypt. And these lines have many technical issues, sometimes man-made, sometimes some technical issues take place. So we have different struggles, and the issue of electricity impacts life in many different ways. If you think of a mother who wants to do laundry, for example, she has to wait for electricity to turn on. Or if a student wants to study for an exam the next day, this student has to wait for electricity to turn on. And if we think of water, getting water, which, speaking of water, 97% of Gaza's water is unfit for human consumption. So even getting this salty water is a challenge in itself, and therefore people buy filtered water. And keeping the situation in mind, the economic situation in mind, not everyone can afford it. And one day, my father made a mistake. He got this sweet water from the municipality, and he filled in the water tank. So in every house in Gaza, we have a water tank specifically used to have sweet water. And my father filled in this tank, and I drank from it. The next day, I slept at the hospital. So we only use it to shower, and it's very dangerous. Yeah, like we get skin infections and other issues, but we cannot drink from it at all. And this problem has been rooted in my mind. So now in Turkey they have clean water, but every time I still buy filtered water because I feel suspicious about it. So this has been the story for 20 years now. And again, because of bombing, the only sewage treatment facility in the Gaza Strip, you see the situation. Municipalities pump sewage into the Mediterranean. And knowing that the Mediterranean is the only place where people could enjoy their lives away from the many life stresses we have in Gaza, this means that large portions of the Mediterranean, the Gaza Sea, is inaccessible. Swimming-wise, it's not clean. And if people swim there, again, they get skin infections. So since then, huge amounts of sewage has been dumped into the Mediterranean. And feeling the danger, Israelis, because seas are not racist, oceans are not racist. So the currents carry the polluted water and sewage into the Israeli side, to the north. And they finally realized the problem, and they gave permissions to some international organizations, such as the International Committee of the Red Cross, to implement some projects to treat sewage, to make sure that it doesn't get to their side. That's not because they care about Gaza, but that's because they care about themselves. And then living in Gaza is just a scene in Gaza. I think a big mosque located just next to my family's house that was leveled to the ground in 2014. And this is a photo of the only power plant in Gaza when it was bombed by Israel in 2014. And you see the huge fire that erupted afterwards, and it lasted for, I think, 1 week, because firefighting teams were not able to go there. Otherwise, they might be targeted by the Israeli military. So it was too dangerous to move around. Keeping in mind, drones are watching us, and we have a joke about drones in Gaza, not just during because this is a daily struggle. We suffer from noise that results from drones. They have dozens of drones hovering around Gaza every day to collect information, and we have a joke that the Israeli army know everything about Gaza because of these drones collecting information, to the extent that they can tell if a family is using frozen meat or fresh meat for lunch. So they know everything. And it's very annoying, buzzing. And my friend wrote a piece about how they are drone that keeps, buzzing around the sky, and especially at night you cannot sleep. And electricity is off, so you cannot, in summer it's really hot, and many people go upstairs, they sleep on the roofs. And again, because of these drones and the noise they produce, it's also another challenge. The UN said Gaza will be unlivable by 2020, and I think Gaza has been unlivable for so many years, and it's getting worse, especially in the last 2-3 years situation. Gaza's economy has been on a free fall, and many people lost their jobs. So young refugees do not see any light at the end of the tunnel, and that's why in 2018, an approximate number of 30,000 Palestinians, most of them were young, left the Gaza Strip, and they're trying to migrate to Europe. And many of them are in Istanbul, in Turkey now, because getting a Turkish visa is easy compared to getting any other visa in the world for Palestinians. Kids have no places to play, so this is how they play. And life has, incubation has shaped our lives in many different ways. Even when kids play, they do not have playgrounds, so they play in the streets and they are barefoot, as you see, and they get a lot of injuries because now this road is somehow paved, but back in the days, I remember that I used to play in the street with my friends, many friends, so Palestinians have a lot of kids, and we are hundreds in the street, so trying to find a place to play, and then neighbors would be screaming at us because we make a lot of noise. And I used to scream at kids when I grow up because cycle of oppression. So they use gun toys because this is our life. And when we used to play our own games, the most famous game was Arabs or Palestinians and Israeli soldiers. So we would divide ourselves into two groups, and I used to enjoy joining the Israeli soldiers group because I used to beat the hell out of my friends. So, but it's very telling, how incubation is part and parcel of our life in the refugee camp. This is a sports club, soccer, Palestinian football club that was bombed by Israel. So they have, every time they have a major offensive against Gaza, they target what they call bank of targets, which includes mostly civilian houses, but also other facilities such as sports facilities, infrastructure, the power plant, and so on and so forth.
What was the name of that? You said they target what kind of targets?
Sports facilities, so it's called the Ahli Sports Club.
You said there's a name for the kind of targets and then
Bank of targets.
Bank.
Yeah, it's a bank, but doesn't have money.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Bank.
Yeah, because so they have so many targets that they became rich, somehow. Yeah. So as we know that Israel launched 3 major offensives on Gaza, this doesn't include minor military operations, which claimed the lives of thousands of Palestinians and destroyed thousands and thousands of Palestinian houses. Up until now, there are homeless people, people who could not rebuild their houses when Israel destroyed their houses back in 2008, 2009. And you can imagine what happened in 2012 and 2014. The number was much bigger. So just an example, 18,000 Palestinian houses were destroyed in 2014, completely destroyed, and some 60,000 Palestinians are still homeless. So getting in and out of Gaza, the fact that the crossings that connect Gaza either with Israel or Egypt have always been shut down except for a limited number of Palestinians and limited number of days throughout the year. Palestinians dug tunnels to smuggle goods, but also other things. So we have military tunnels. By then, we had military tunnels. They were secret, but there were a vast majority of tunnels. And I think military tunnels have always existed between Gaza and Egypt. This is not a secret. But also, the vast majority of these tunnels, almost 1,500 tunnels, and there is, a way to dig tunnels, and so there were experts who were brought and paid huge amounts of money to locate where and how to start digging these tunnels, because just an example, like a Palestinian smuggling his wife through a tunnel. Some of these tunnels were really big, and they wanted to make sure that they did not collapse through winter, during winter, and some of them were used to smuggle cows and cars, so they were really big. So they started to use concrete or what to build these tunnels, but eventually these tunnels were shut down by Egypt, and the only way to get in and out of Gaza these days is the Rafah crossing, And I have a long story with the Rafah crossing, not just me, but every single Palestinian in Gaza does. These are like hundreds and thousands of desperate Palestinians trying to leave the Rafah crossing. Because if you try to leave through Israel as a young person, 99% you will not get the permit. And I tried to leave through Israel one time, 2013, so I got the Jordanian permit, but not the Israeli one, so I do not leave. And there are tens of thousands of Palestinians at any given time who are registered to travel through the Rafah crossing. Rafah is a very famous city because of the crossing now. And in the past, the Rafah crossing was shut down most of the time, except for a few days. Now it's open. It has been open for the last maybe 6 or 8 months, but it's the same story. In the past, they used to allow, for example, 3,000 Palestinians out in 2 or 3 days. Now they allow 100 or 200 Palestinians out every day. So it's the same number of Palestinians, but at least now we can claim that the Rafah crossing is open. And there is no guarantee that Palestinians will be allowed into Egypt once they get to the, it's turn to travel, to get into the queue and get their names published so that they could travel the next day. And as I said, there are thousands of people who are registered, so we have to queue to wait for months and sometimes years. And if you have a visa, of course, it will expire while waiting for the Rafah crossing to open. And the journey out of Gaza is a piece of torture. So this year, because I did not want to take the risk and go back to Gaza and see my family, I've been out of Gaza for 3 years during my PhD. I brought my parents to visit me in Turkey for 2 weeks. And they waited for 3 months until it was their turn, and we had to talk to different people. And the journey out of Gaza took them 1 full day. It's a 6-hour drive. But because they are old, they were allowed into Egypt. So if you are young, you are not allowed into Egypt. And they put you on a deportation bus, and you have to go through a limited number of checkpoints. Just to correct myself, the journey out of Gaza took them 2 days because there is a curfew in the Sinai starting from 5 or 6 p.m. So they were late. They did not give them their passports, which means that they had to sleep one night at the Palestinian-Egyptian border, and then the next day they took a car to Cairo, and again they were allowed into Cairo because they were old, and for young people they are deported. So the journey starts like this. Once we get to the border, after waiting for so many months, and sometimes it extends to years, we get on the bus after being allowed into Egypt, and we are not allowed to carry our passports. So we get our passports in Cairo, and that's for Palestinians traveling outside Egypt, not to Egypt. If they are traveling to Egypt and they convince the officer in charge, they get into Egypt. And there are dozens of checkpoints on our way, so every time we are stopped, checked, and we sleep one night maybe before the Suez Canal, and after we cross, so it takes us up to 3 days to get to Cairo. So it's a piece of torture, and every time a Palestinian travels, they say, this is the last time I travel. And going back to Gaza is the same story. I took my parents 3 days to go back to Gaza. However, they were traveling on their own. They were not deported. And many Palestinians say it's safer to be deported than traveling alone in the Sinai, because we know the situation, security situation in the Sinai. And the situation at the Israeli border, once you get a permit, it's much better, but you never get a permit. So it's collective punishment in a different way. I'll explain this shortly. So I thought, we are not numbers, we are stories, and we have personal narratives that deserve to be told. And I think people do relate to personal narratives, and I hope that personal narratives will lead to change one day, because there has been a fierce campaign of dehumanization against Palestinians. In 2004, a year before Israel decided to withdraw from the Gaza Strip, and starting from 2000, the second Palestinian uprising broke out. The Israeli army would break into different refugee camps and kill some Palestinians, say 10, 15, do militia house, and then leave. and they would come from colonies and settlements that used to exist in the Gaza Strip. So in 2004, my eldest brother was shot dead, and he was left to bleed for 4 hours. They did not allow, the Israeli snipers did not allow paramedics to provide him with any help. As a result, he passed away. And because they, shut down, because they always prevent fuel from getting into Gaza, electricity is off most of the time, and that's why Palestinians at night only make one thing: babies. So my parents ended up with another baby 2 years later, and as expected, they named him after my eldest brother. So I ended up with 2 brothers named Omar, and I published a short story here called Omar X. It's like Malcolm X, about my eldest brother as well as my youngest brother, who had to be named after a brother who was shot dead, and the struggle of having this name growing up. And I also wanted to immortalize my eldest brother through fiction, and how he was in the high school, and he was killed in action because he decided to take arms and fight instead of being at school. How military occupation again shapes the lives of Palestinians. And I also wrote articles about this. And again, my brother, and on that day, 13 other Palestinians were killed. So his story is not unique. And if you look at the numbers of Palestinians who were killed throughout the second Palestinian uprising, whether in Gaza or the West Bank, we're talking about thousands. So his story is not unique. This is my mother with her West Bank family in 2012. So my mother grew up in Bethlehem, and she moved to Gaza when she got married in 1978. And it took her 12 years to get an Israeli permit to visit her family and hometown in the West Bank, because she changed her address to Gaza. So if you have a Palestinian ID where your address is in Gaza, you get the worst kind of treatment. And then the same is applicable to Palestinians from the West Bank. So we have different sets of IDs of Palestinians depending on where they live, including Palestinians who live in Jerusalem. So it's layers of discrimination and dehumanization. And then you have Palestinians who live in Israel who have Israeli citizenship on paper, but they are treated as second, third, or fourth class citizens. So in 2003, 2008, her parents passed away, and she was not able to go to the West Bank to participate in the funeral procession. However, it's just 1 hour drive away from my refugee camp in Gaza. So I wrote about her and the struggle. And again, she's not unique. This is the story of many Palestinian families. I wrote an article about her struggling to see her family in the West Bank, and then more media people came in and they interviewed her, and this shows the impact that a personal story may have. Finally, we got an Israeli human rights organization called Gisha, which means passage, and it helps Palestinians move in and out of the Palestinian territories, especially between Gaza and the West Bank. They filed a suit before the Israeli Supreme Court on her behalf, and finally she was granted a 4-day permit to visit her family in the West Bank. And of course, she stayed there for 32 days, a day for every year she spent in Gaza by them. And she was considered, illegal in the West Bank because she overstayed. In 2015, 3 years later, she was granted another Israeli permit because her eldest brother passed away. So the only time, this is not a general rule, but it happens very often, at least with my mother, the only time Israel gives Palestinians permits is when to visit Gaza and the West Bank, or to move from Gaza to the West Bank, and vice versa, is when a first-degree relative passes away. And this is not guaranteed. There are Palestinians who were denied, this permit, but she was lucky enough to go there. And in 2019, this year, she was granted 2 permits to go to Jerusalem, but not to the West Bank because she got breast cancer. And again, she was lucky enough to get to the West Bank, to Jerusalem, because there are dozens of Palestinian cancer patients who passed away in Gaza waiting for their Israeli permits. And in many cases, Israel would grant them a permit after they pass away. Or they would grant them a permit the first time, they have the first chemotherapy session, but not the second time. And they will ask them to collaborate against their people in return for permits. So many Palestinians choose to die in Gaza rather than to collaborate against their people. And speaking of patients and Palestinians who passed away because of this system of oppression and permits. My sister passed away in 2007. She was an UNRWA teacher. And she was newly married, 26 years old by then. And she needed a minor surgery. So the reason Palestinians apply for Israeli permits, and speaking of Rafah doesn't have a hospital. And I think it's one great project to help with in Gaza is to build a hospital for Rafah. But again, even in other cities where there are hospitals, these hospitals are not equipped to deal or treat, very basic, or to have very basic surgeries. So only because she needed a minor surgery was not available in Gaza, she applied for an Israeli permit. And let alone, cancer and other chronic diseases. But even she needed a minor surgery to remove a network that was installed back in the days when she removed her gallbladder. So she was denied this permit, and she was at the hospital at the time, and her health deteriorated, got much worse. A week later, she got a rejection from Israel. And the only way to get out of Gaza, if you are not allowed to get in by Israel, is through Egypt. And I explained the situation at the Rafah crossing, so it was shut down by then. In 2007, a week later it was open, and she managed to get out, but it was too late. She had the surgery, but 2 days later she passed away in Cairo. And my father and my aunt were with her, and they had to bring her body back to Gaza. So they went to a hospital in Al-Arish city, which is 50 kilometers away from the Gaza-Egypt border. And they tried to bring her body twice to the border, 2 different days. The Israeli army would send them back with her body, and finally on the 3rd day, they gave them the permit to get into Gaza. And again, my sister is not an exception. I know almost 1,000 or 800 Palestinians who passed away, excluding cancer patients, because of the siege and not being able to have minor surgeries. So I wrote an article about her and her story as an example of people passing away under siege. In 2014, 2,200 Palestinians were killed, and thousands and thousands others were injured, including my childhood friend Ayman Shukur. I was in Jordan at the time because I wanted to see my West Bank family. I haven't seen them for 15 years, so the only way to meet was in Jordan. And getting to Jordan is not easy, but it's doable. So I flew from Kuala Lumpur, and I got to see my West Bank family because there was a wedding there. So some of them came over. I got to see some of my aunts and cousins. And in what's supposed to be a happy gathering, because there was a wedding, it turned into a sad one because I received the news of his killing. He was standing on the roof of his family's house in refugee camp when Israel was randomly shelling the area. He was not part of any political party. And he was a graduate of Arabic literature, a smart man, a painter. And while standing on the roof of his family's house, a random Israeli shell turned his body into pieces. So I documented his story. And moving from the stories of my family and friends, I thought, documenting the stories in general is a good approach to inform people so that people can relate to Palestinian experience under occupation. Again, because we are very often dehumanized. So moving to that, I got involved in translating a number of books and stories, including this book, Dreaming of Freedom, which documents the struggles Palestinian children go through in Israeli jails, which highlights this very critical and important issue. And it includes 29 stories of Palestinian children who were detained by Israel, and then 5 of them are still in jail. 24 of them were released. And we got the 5 stories of child prisoners in jail through a human rights organization called Defense of Children International Palestine. And it's an important organization. I invite you all to check their website. But those who were released were interviewed by journalists, and then we got their stories translated into English. The book now is available in Malaysia as well as the US, and it's available in Arabic in Jerusalem as well. So speaking of the issue of Palestinian child prisoners in Israeli jails, Israel is the only country in the world that prosecutes Palestinian children, Palestinian civilians, including Palestinian children, before a system of military courts. And they discriminate against Palestinian children as well as Israeli children who live in the same area in the West Bank, Israeli children who live in illegal settlements in the West Bank, and Palestinians who live in Bantustans next to them, where Palestinian children are considered those under the age of 18, and Palestinian children are considered those under the age of 18, and Israeli children are considered those under the age of 16. And speaking of this issue, Israel targets Palestinians in East Jerusalem in particular when it comes to child detention at a very much higher scale, in the hope that they create a submissive Palestinian generation in the city, let alone other issues Palestinians have in Jerusalem, such as house demolitions and high taxes and drugs and unemployment. So at any given time, there are 250 Palestinian children in Israeli jails who are subjected to ill treatment, torture, whether psychological or physical. These children are taken from their houses in the middle of the night, and Israel does this on purpose again, because they want to terrify the children and their families. They can send summons to Palestinians in the West Bank, including in Jerusalem, and these families could bring, the children to interrogation centers the next day. But they prefer to break into Palestinian houses, arrest these children, turn the house upside down, and beat these, children before their families, in front of their families. And in some cases, if they do not find the children in the house, they would take their parents or other siblings as hostages until they turn themselves into the Israeli army. These children are blindfolded, bound, and shackled. They are interrogated very often without the presence of their parents or their lawyers. And finally, they are forced to sign confessions in Hebrew, a language they do not understand. Some of these children are sentenced to months, some of them are released to house arrest, some of them are sentenced to years, and some of them, the 5 stories I mentioned, which I will go into detail in a minute, some of them were sentenced to 15 years in jail. But whether they spend months or years in Israeli jails, they all have this experience of trauma upon their release, and just you need to look at their faces to realize the level of trauma they went through. This is an example of a Palestinian child being, arrested by Israeli soldiers in the West Bank. So the book was dedicated to a child prisoner from Jerusalem called Ayman Abbasi, because he was interviewed for the book, but he did not live long enough to see it published. Again, it's a system of oppression where this child was arrested, and upon his release from Israeli jails, while participating in a peaceful demonstration in Jerusalem against Israeli practices and restrictions, he was shot dead by the Israeli army. Not only this, they tried to kidnap his body. So the Israeli army has an established policy of kidnapping dead bodies of Palestinians they shoot dead in the West Bank, and in some cases at the Gaza fence with Israel, and they would hold these bodies for years sometimes to use them in any future swap deal with the Palestinians. They place them in what they call numbers graveyards, where each Palestinian is given a number, So you go there 1, 2, 3, 4. You never know their names because it's secret for them. They keep these secret records and in secret places, and in many cases these records were lost, and some of the graves were washed away because of floods and rain. So they tried to kidnap his body after killing him, and not only this, they fired at people who tried to run, to take his body and run away from the Israeli army, but people were successful in running away, taking his body, moving from one street to another, from one neighborhood to another, until they managed to smuggle his body to the graveyard. And this means that the Israeli, his family was not able to see him before he was led to rest. Here he speaks of his experience and how he was tortured in Israeli detention. He says, "The moment I was arrested, I expected to be beaten. However, at the interrogation center, I was hit so badly in the face that when my family saw me at court, they could barely recognize me because of the marks and bruises." This is a photo of a Palestinian female child prisoners. So the vast majority of child prisoners are males, but there are also female child prisoners like Ahli Tamimi, Rima Al-Khatib, Ilwawi, and Malak Al-Khatib. Malak was 14 years old, going back home from school on a spring day. She liked some wild flowers on her way, so she got to the field and she tried to pick up these flowers. She was arrested by Israeli forces who were in the area, accusing her of accessing a restricted military zone. And she spent, I think, 7 months in Israeli jails, and this is her photo upon her release from Israeli jails, and you could see the trauma in her face. This is her story. She says, "I was released and my heart was still full of sorrow, not because I was arrested, but rather because of the injustice Palestinians are still facing. I still have so much sorrow in my heart because the darkness in our lives has not yet come to an end, and we, the victims, are still struggling on the path to freedom." The one interesting aspect is that Israel tries to create a submissive Palestinian generation by arresting Palestinian child prisoners. But what I have noticed is that they become, in Israeli jails, and following their release, they become politically engaged more than they used to be before their arrests. I assume that some of you have been to Hebron, in the West Bank, and there is a segregated road called Shohada Street, the Martyrs Street, where hundreds of Israeli settlers live in the area, and they turn the lives of Palestinians, tens of thousands of Palestinians who live there, into complete misery. Israeli settlers who live on this road, segregated road, Palestinians have their own lane and Israelis have their own lane. Palestinians are not allowed to pass to the other side and vice versa. Are known to be very violent and radical, and very often they throw stones, rocks, cocktails, whatever they find rubbish at Palestinians. So Palestinians had to build sort of protection to make sure that they are not harmed. And Yazan lives on this road, and he was 14, going back home when a group of Israeli settlers jumped to the Palestinian side and they assaulted him. Again, the Israeli army came, and instead of arresting these settlers, they arrested the Palestinian child. They took him to the interrogation center, and he was released. I was doing some research on him, and I found out that he was re-arrested again in 2017, and this is a photo of him. So we're talking about multiple arrests of children. Some of these children are arrested twice, 3 times, 4 times. And one of the children whose story is in the book was arrested more than 10 times. This is his story. He says, They scream at us and beat us, referring to Israeli settlers who live in the area where he lives. All of this disturbs the tranquility of our lives from the day we come into this world. Arresting me without committing any crime gave me more determination to continue to exist here. I still live in my family's house and in my street, in my little neighborhood. I will never leave, he says. Okay, so to conclude with, there is a very famous case of 5 Palestinian children who were arrested by Israel and sentenced to 15 years in jail, known as the 5 Haris boys. Haris is a village in the West Bank, and there is a bypass road by the village where Jews only can drive, and a car accident took place there between an Israeli truck and an Israeli car, and this resulted in the serious injury of 3 settlers who were in the car. And the driver of the car initially told the court that the car accident resulted from a flat tire. Then he changed his narrative, saying that the car accident was a result of stones thrown at him while driving by Palestinian children. And of course, the Israeli military court took his narrative for granted, and the Israeli army broke into the village of Haris in the West Bank, arrested 5 children, tortured them, and got others to confess that, some of these children confessed that their other friends did throw stones at Israeli soldiers, Israeli cars, which resulted in the car accident. And again, they were sentenced to 15 years in jail. They are still in jail. They were 12, 13, 14 years old. And one of them holds a Palestinian Jordanian passport. His father doesn't hold a Palestinian passport. And so in order to see him, he has to wait sometimes 3 years to get an Israeli permit to visit him. Even family visits for these children is very challenging. One last point is the issue of house arrest. And again, Israel does this on purpose. They know the impact that house arrests might have on families. When Palestinian children are arrested by Israel and they are thrown into jails, it's the Israeli jailers and Palestinian children who get into the chilling, the fight. Where Palestinians, the oppressed and occupied people, face their occupiers and oppressors. This is the normal equation. But when Palestinian children are, upon their release from Israeli jails, and maybe having to pay high fines, are placed under house arrest, the jailers become their own families. And you can imagine the psychological impact this might have on a child. Children want to go to school, their families prevent them because they want to make sure that they stick by the terms of the agreement of their release. Otherwise, they will be rearrested again, or they might be asked to pay high fines. Children want to play with their friends in the street. They cannot go out because their families prevent them from doing so. So Israel does this on purpose to destroy the social fabric of Palestinian families. And very often, these children are placed under house arrest for 6 months, and in some cases they are placed under house arrest outside their village, for example, at their uncle's house. Okay, so what to do? Because it's very painful to narrate these stories, right? And I think it's even harder for children to speak about their trauma in Israeli jails. So we need to take action. What to do? Now there is a bill in the House of Representatives that thankfully Representative Bokhan signed into, Kosmosat, which was introduced by Representative Betty McCollum. It's called HR 2407. And it calls for a very fair demand to make sure that US tax money, because part of this detention of Palestinian children is done by this tax money that is given to Israel annually in the form of foreign aid by the United States. So part of this money is US money, and it's used to torture and detain Palestinian children. The bill simply wants to make sure that US money, tax money, given to any country in the world is not used to torture and detain Palestinian children or any children in the world, not just Palestinian children. And I think this is a very fair demand. It's not controversial, but if you look at the number of Congress people who signed into this bill, you can figure out that some people maybe want to be saved because they will get a backlash, or they think this is a controversial topic. As the representative just said, it's very complicated. We don't want to get into that. And I think it's a very fair demand, looking at the experiences of these children, to get all Congress people. I don't think that Republicans will sign into this bill, but at least some Democrats in the House of Representatives to sign into the bill. So if any of you who has a representative in the House of maybe from a different district, some of you are, to make sure that your representatives sign into this bill to provide some protection for Palestinian children, and to make sure that they are at schools rather than under house arrest or in military courts or prisons. So this is one way to support the rights of Palestinian children, is to get your Congress people to support this bill. And to thank those who did, because they get a backlash. So to stick and support those who signed into the bill. And we want to let them know that there are people who support them on the ground, who believe in what they did. And again, to try to convince those who did not to do so. And speaking of Rafah city, to conclude with, I think, a great project. Now, I've been following Palestinians on social media, especially from Rafah. And the fact that Rafah doesn't have a hospital is very appalling, because Rafah has at least 250,000 people living there. And when Israel bombed the Gaza Strip in 2014, there was a Friday that was called Black Friday, in which Israel killed hundreds of Palestinians, and many of them were from Rafah, because an Israeli soldier was captured by Hamas. So Palestinians at the time were not from Rafah, were not able to go to the hospital in Khan Yunis because Israel cut all forms of transportation. They made sure that they destroyed the infrastructure and roads that take to Khan Yunis. So a great project. If you want to know what Palestinians in Rafah want on the ground, is to build a hospital in Rafah. And I invite you to think about this idea and to see how possible it is to get this project done. I will stop here, and I would like to hear your reflections and questions. Thank you very much.